Hey there. Welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Studies the Bible. We're going to be continuing our series on Jesus's moral coda, which is essentially the coda that every Christian should take upon themselves when they call themselves a Christian. It's essentially the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus's moral coda. And so I'm going to be analyzing another aspect of the Sermon on the Mount, and why, number one, why it's controversial, and then number two, why I think it's good for humanity, and why I think it is that Jesus said that we should do this. Now, this particular teaching, in terms of its controversial nature, I think stems from the fact that our society right now places a heavy emphasis on both kindness and empathy, two things which I think are, to a degree, Christian values. And so as a Christian, I think that both empathy and kindness are good things, but I think that they can be taken to an extreme that makes them into bad things. And so if they don't have proper parameters around them, they can actually become bad things. And so I think that Jesus' teaching here actually teaches us what those parameters should be. And so let's go ahead and get into the teaching. So in case anybody wants to follow along, it's the teaching is found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. And so read that here to you. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. All right, so before we actually get into the teaching, I should explain what Jesus is talking about in this passage. So essentially, Jesus is discussing oaths, right? And essentially it's the same kind of thing as we do today when we say, "I swear on my mother's grave that this is true," right? So he's saying we shouldn't do that. And why does he say that we shouldn't do that? Back in his day, essentially what would happen is the religious leaders would make oaths, right? And they'd make the oath by the temple or by Jerusalem. Those are the examples that Jesus uses. And then they wouldn't actually fulfill their oath. And so then when they would get called out on it, essentially what they'd do is they'd say, well, I wasn't actually swearing by the temple itself. I was swearing by the altar within the temple. And so it doesn't actually count as me swearing by the temple. And so actually I'm liberated from my obligation. I don't actually have to fulfill the oath that I made. And so essentially what Jesus is attacking there is obfuscation of language. So you being intentionally vague when you say that you're going to do something, so that way you have an out later on if you don't actually accomplish what you say that you're going to accomplish, or whatever the situation might be that you feel the need to lie in. If you use vague enough language on the front end, then you have an out later on the back end, right? And so that's what Jesus is attacking there. And he's saying, look, don't use vague language. Don't even bother making oaths. Don't even bother swearing. Just say what you mean. If you are committing to do something, then do it. And if you can't do what you are being asked to do, then say, no, I'm not going to do that. And just be straightforward, be blunt about what it is that you are able to do or not able to do. And part of the reason for this is that Jesus doesn't want people being manipulated by people who are capable of using language in a way that doesn't fix them in on a commitment, right? And so, Jesus, because ultimately all of his teachings stream from the idea of do unto others what you'd have them do unto you, Jesus doesn't want you to say something that is able to be interpreted one way or another by the other person but then, you know, and more than likely on your end, you're intending for it to be interpreted one way by the other person, but you, in fact, intend it to be interpreted the way that you want it to be interpreted, so that way you can manipulate that person and then not be beholden to your own word. So that's essentially what Jesus is getting at, to essentially be honest at all times and to be straightforward with the things that you say. All right, so why is this controversial in our culture? It's controversial because our culture places a heavy emphasis on empathy and kindness and treating people with kindness, which ultimately I think is kind of rooted in the idea that Jesus sets forth that we should do unto others as we'd have them do unto us, right? And so essentially what's happening, right, is what we're after, right, when we say that we want a culture that's governed by kindness and empathy, is we want a culture where everyone treats each other the way that they want to be treated, right? Now, the trouble with that is how I want to be treated is a tricky thing to get at, right? Because if I'm asking you a question, do I want you to spare my feelings, or do I want you to tell me the truth? So I wanna give an example here, right? So I like writing. I've liked writing since I was a teenager, and even before then, when I was a kid, I used to get my action figures, you know, my Batman action figure and Robin and Joker and all that, and I would tell little stories, you know, as a 7-year-old kid with my action figures. I'd make up little stories, and then later on, when I became a teenager, I started taking creative writing classes in school, and I loved creative writing. Later on in college, even though I didn't get a degree in anything related to creative writing, I kept taking creative writings all throughout my college career, essentially, because I enjoyed creative writing so much. So I love writing, right? It's an aspect of my identity to write. So I enjoy it. It's an investment of my time that I feel is valuable, and it brings me pleasure when I have completed the writing. So it's something that's very important to me, right? And so obviously there's a lot of emotion invested in my writing. So let's create a scenario here. So I print out something that I've written, I take it to a friend, and I ask them the question: is my writing good? Now, let's think about this. If I want to have, if the scenario presented to my friend is do unto others what I'd have them do unto me, let's say that my friend reads my writing and it's bad, right? What is his responsibility in that moment? Is it to spare my feelings? Because if he was in my situation, he wouldn't want his feelings hurt. Or is it to tell me the truth? And this is the tricky thing about that situation, right? Is sparing my feelings ultimately what's best for me? And is it ultimately what he would want to have done to him? And what I mean by that is, if I'm actually asking you whether or not my writing is good, let's say that in my head I want you to say yes, because it is what I want you to say. If I give you some of my writing, I want you to say that it's yes, that it's good. But what if it's not? Do I want you to say that? The reality is, if I don't want you to say that it's not good, I shouldn't ask you whether or not it's good. And there's a reason for that. Because if my writing is in fact bad, and I continue writing in the same style that I have been writing, ultimately, I am wasting my time. Now, let's say that I go one step further and I actually dedicate a bunch of time to trying to get some of my writing published. And now I'm sending out writing samples to all these different publishers. It's getting rejected at all times. And all the while in my head, I'm like, well, but wait a minute. I asked my friend if I'm a good writer, and he told me I'm a good writer. What? Now at this point, I'm getting all these rejections. I've invested even more emotion in the idea that I'm a good writer. What my friend has actually done is set me up for failure, in which case it's actually worse off for me, because by sparing my emotions in the moment, he's actually destroyed my emotions in the long run, right? And so ultimately, in that moment, what my friend should do is tell me the truth, regardless of how it's going to make me feel in that moment. And I would actually argue that that's actually the more empathetic person, the one who actually tells the truth, because he's not just worried about your emotions in the moment, he's worried about your emotions in the long run. And so to me, the idea that we wouldn't tell the truth to one another because we want to be kind to each other is actually a counterintuitive perspective. If you want to be kind to somebody else, you have to tell them the truth, because ultimately you're sparing a greater pain for them in the long run. And on the flip side of that, if you want to be somebody who goes out and asks questions, you should actually be expecting a truthful answer. And that goes for all kinds of questions. If you don't want the answer to a truthful answer to a question, why are you asking that question? The obvious psychological reason, right, is because you want to be reaffirmed in your beliefs. But is that healthy for you? Is that good for you if you're doing something that's wrong? Or it might not even be wrong. It might just be, like I said in the example of my writing. It's not wrong for me to be a bad writer, but it's not good for me to be a good writer, to be a bad writer. It's because ultimately, like, I'm investing all this time and energy into something that I'm not very good at, and maybe I could be investing that time into something else, or maybe I could be investing time into getting better, because maybe if I don't know that I'm not good at something, I need to be told that I'm not good at something, so that way I can figure out what it is that I'm doing that isn't good, and that way I can get better at it. And so ultimately, the scenario in which I'm told the truth is actually what's best for me. And so a society that runs off of the idea that telling people what they want to hear in the moment is what's good for them is ultimately a society that's slowly and slowly and slowly destroying itself, because all it's doing is increasing and increasing and increasing the situations in which people are hurt in a much larger fashion than if they were told the truth, right from the onset. And so I think that that's why Jesus is so gung-ho about telling the truth. I think that that's why he makes the point that we should tell the truth to one another, because ultimately, even if the truth hurts in the moment, the truth is ultimately the thing that burns away the bad and helps you to arrive at a better situation. And in order for people to grow, in order for people to get better, in order for people to improve, the truth has to be told. And if you're the sort of person that likes manipulating other people, and so being able to lie is something that you want to be able to get away with, again, you should take into consideration, do you want other people doing that to you? And do we want to construct a society of people that think like that? Could a society even function like that? In fact, could the person who is manipulative that way continue to function if all people were that way? No, only that situation only works if you are a select few amongst the many, so that you can take advantage of the larger body that's honest, right? And so that's ultimately what Jesus is trying to do here, right? Is construct a society. What Jesus is trying to do is construct a church, but so a group of people that operate in this way, that are always honest with each other. Now, there's one common objection to always telling the truth, and I actually think it's a good objection. I think it's a valid objection. I don't want to treat it lightly, because I think that it's a fair objection, which is, what happens when telling the truth, when the cost of telling the truth is at the expense of something very valuable like somebody's life, for example, right? And so the very common ethical situation that's always discussed when you talk about the truth is, what if you're living in Nazi Germany and you are one of those good, decent people who housed the Jews and was keeping the Jews safe from the Nazis, and then the Gestapo shows up at your door and asks you if you have Nazis in your, if you have Jews hidden in your house. What do you do in that scenario? Do you lie? In order to answer that, before I say that, I would like to say, I completely understand that in that situation, you are between a rock and a hard place. And it's very, very difficult for me sitting in my comfortable room here in front of my bookshelf to tell you, what the right thing to do is. So I completely understand that. Having said that, I want to share a story that was shared with me by a professor who had an aunt who was actually in that exact situation. So she was living in Germany during the Nazi occupation, and she had friends that were Jews, and she was hiding them in her home. And one night, late at night, the Gestapo came and banged on her door. Apparently one of her neighbors had detected or had noticed that she had Jews in her house and had called the Gestapo, and so the Gestapo came to her door to question her. And she opened the door, and they asked her, "Madam, are you housing Jews in your house?" So it's the exact ethical scenario that is always talked about. Now, this woman was a Christian, and so she believed what Jesus said, which is that we need to tell the truth in all circumstances, right? And so this is what she told them. Instead of lying and saying no, this is what she told them. She said, "You are free to search my home." Now the Gestapo, instead of searching her home, got very frustrated and said, "Ma'am, we didn't ask you if we could search your home. We asked you, are you housing Jews in your house?" And again, she told them, "You're free to come in and search my home." And so at this point, the officer, he starts getting upset and saying, "Madam, we didn't ask you if we could go into your house. We asked you if you're housing Jews in your house." And for a third time, she told them, "Sir, feel free to come in and search my house." And at this point, the general, or the officer, he got very upset. He started yelling, and then him and his men stormed off, and they never went into the house. And so I tell that story because, again, part of the intent of this channel is that I want to talk to people who maybe are not Christians. And so I understand that what I'm about to say is very difficult if you're in that situation. But Jesus, when he sets forth his moral coda, is under the assumption that there is a God who is capable of manipulating reality to his ends. And so when he instructs you to do something, there are times where that something is going to be very difficult. And for this woman, I feel like that's the definition of an incredibly difficult moral situation, right? Or ethical situation. What is she supposed to do? And so because she believes that there is a God who can manipulate reality the same way that Jesus believed that, for her benefit, she doesn't lie. And she believes that because God has instructed her to do this, he will intervene and manipulate reality and make it so that essentially she's going to be okay. And in this situation, that's what happened. She was okay. And so the act of telling the truth ultimately, and this is why I understand that if you're not a believer in the Christian God, this can be very difficult to swallow, but I'm going to state it. Telling the truth is an act of faith, because telling the truth assumes that whatever the best scenario, whatever the best possible outcome is is always generated by the truth that is told. And so, if you're a Christian, ultimately, if you say that you have faith in this God, then that's what you need to do. You need to assume that the best possible result is always going to be the one that comes by telling the truth. And the reality is that that woman in that situation could have had her house searched. The Jews could have been found, and her and the Jews would have been arrested and likely put in a concentration camp. She was trusting that if that's what happened, that God would be with them, and that situation was what was best. And ultimately, that's what a Christian should always believe, is if I do what God tells me to do, if I do what Jesus instructs me to do, if I follow the moral coda, then what happens is what's going to be best. And it may not look like it's the best, but that's the assumption. That's the assumption that we have to make as Christians. Now, if you're not a Christian, like I said, do we want a society built upon the idea that we should all be able to lie to each other? Or do we want a society that's built upon the idea that we should all be honest with each other? How are we going to conduct business? How are we going to, have governments or anything if essentially we're all assuming that we're all lying to each other all the time, and we can't trust one another at all? I mean, I would argue that is kind of the society that we have right now, where nobody can trust each other, and so it essentially paralyzes us, because it's very difficult for us to all interact with one another if none of us assumes that the other person is telling the truth, rather than trying to manipulate society or you for their own ends. It's very difficult to have relationships. It's very difficult, again, to run businesses, to have managers and employees. It's very difficult to have governments overseeing us. It's very difficult for us to even, exchange pleasantries with one another if we're going to assume that the other person has ill intent. And that is what happens when everybody has agreed mutually, hey, it's okay if we all lie to each other. And so, ultimately, I think that Jesus wasn't interested in a society like that. Personally, I'm not either, which is why I'm a Christian. If you've stuck around this long, I thank you so much for putting up with me. I love you very much, and I hope to see you next week.